There's a really good analogy that we can use to describe the United States right now that a lot of people are not going to like, but that is still absolutely undeniably true. And for that analogy, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that you were born into an extremely wealthy family. A family that had built up a family business over many generations, starting from your great-great-grandfather and then on down through your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, and now to you. Generations ago, this family business was started from the ground up, from absolutely nothing. And for generations, blood, sweat, and tears were put into the family business to build its foundation, to make it successful. And it's now come to the point where it is the most profitable and most powerful companies on the face of the earth. But now that you've inherited it, imagine that you do something strange. Instead of looking at the profits, which are immense, you start to look at the expenses and you start to get upset about them. You start to look at the fact that you have to pay employees, the fact that you have to pay for energy to run your factories and things like that. And so you decide the family cannot continue to incur these expenses anymore. And so what you do is you start closing down the most profitable sectors of your entire company. And you start bragging about the fact that you no longer have to pay these employees, you no longer have to pay for these factories, these facilities, etc., etc. Completely missing the fact that in closing off these sectors of the company, you're not just cutting off the expenses, you're also cutting off the profits that came as a result of those expenses. And now all this capital expenditure that has been put in over generations, where you've reached the point where all you have to do is reap the benefits, bring in the rewards, you've completely undermined all of that work because you don't know what you're doing. As I said, this is the perfect analogy for what the United States is doing right now, and it's undeniable, so let's get into the details. Recently, of course, the United States has unveiled their new national security strategy. And a lot of people have been very excited about that, and a lot of people have criticized it very heavily. And I wanted in this video to give my thoughts on what that security strategy actually means, not just in the context of what is going on in the world today, but in the context of actual American history and what has made the United States so successful. Because from my perspective, the people who are cheering on this new national security strategy, it makes sense to their minds because of what has been going on in the political discourse over the past couple of decades. But they don't realize how disconnected it is from our actual national story as Americans and what has actually made the United States objectively the single most powerful and the single wealthiest country in human history. And from my perspective, the people who are cheering this strategy on, they're a lot like the people in the family business analogy who are really excited because we are cutting operational costs, not realizing that those operational costs weren't actually expenses, but they were the things that allowed us to generate the profits that we are used to. And now we're going to be surprised over the next coming decades if this comes to full fruition, when we start losing the profits that we were used to, not realizing it's because we sabotaged our own system that was working for us very well and didn't actually need to be changed. This new national security strategy, of course, has many themes, but the primary themes center around the United States changing its perspective from being a global policeman to being more of a regional power focused more on the Western Hemisphere. And the big idea behind this is that the United States is going back to the times of the Monroe Doctrine, where around the times of the Monroe Doctrine, when the United States was a much younger nation, we said that we were going to be the regional power in the Western Hemisphere, and that was how we were going to build our power base and our wealth. A lot of people look back at this era as if it's sort of a golden era, and for the United States in many ways it was. But what a lot of people miss is that it wasn't a golden era because we were restricted to the Western Hemisphere. It was a golden era because we were expanding from not having any sphere of influence at all to now having a defined sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Since the time of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has, of course, expanded its influence beyond the Western Hemisphere to become a global power. And our rise as a global power has objectively coincided with our rise to become the most powerful and wealthiest nation in human history. So having the West as our region of control, our region of influence, that wasn't the ultimate, but rather it was the stepping stone that allowed us to reach the ultimate, which we are currently, or at least which we have been, sitting in for several decades. When it comes to the United States' global position, of course, in American political discourse, there have been a lot of people who have criticized that over the past several decades. And they have looked, for example, at how expensive it is to maintain the U.S. military, how expensive it is to intervene in other countries when things are going awry and they need some help and protection, how expensive it is, for example, to send humanitarian aid to these countries and things like that. And all people ever focus on are these expenses because they're clear, they're direct, and they're actual line items in the budget that you can look and criticize and say, well, this must be what's bringing our country down. But what a lot of people don't realize is that all these expenses, the expenses incurred with us being a global policeman and the expenses incurred with us giving humanitarian aid to other countries, are actually the operating costs that are needed to make our country as profitable and as powerful as it is, although because these profits and this power doesn't show up as directly as line items on a budget, it's harder to quantify, but it can be quantified and it can be measured in effects, and we can see that by looking back at history. What the new U.S. national security strategy is doing is it is actually rather explicitly trying to unwind the world order that was created following World War II. Which, when you look back in history, this is also the same period where the United States really became a major player on the global stage. A lot of people don't realize that in World War I and World War II, while the United States was growing in power, they were not the major global power like they are today. That came after the wars, and it largely came because of the national security strategy, the global strategy that the United States pursued. What happened after World War II, and if you remember, the United States was suffering from the Great Depression leading up to World War II, was that the United States now entered a period of massive economic boom. In fact, we have the phrase, the boomers, to refer to this generation that experienced really unprecedented wealth rather quickly. And the reason this happened was twofold. First and foremost, in World War II, most major global economies in Europe and in Asia were completely devastated. In the United States, while it was involved in the war, its homeland was never touched. So we were left with this large manufacturing infrastructure at exactly the time where Europe and Asia really needed to rebuild, and for a period we had a monopoly. And the United States made the very strategic decision to use that monopoly, that position of dominance, to reach back in and provide some of that wealth back to Europe to help them reconstruct so that we could interact with Europe economically and strategically. This was something called the Marshall Plan, you may have heard of it, where the United States, for two selfish reasons, did good for other countries. And the two selfish reasons were that we wanted our own economy to boom, which it did, and we also wanted to empower Europe to be a powerful ally with us against the Soviet Union. The United States was always the major partner in this effort from the very beginning, again, because the European economies, because the European nations had been totally destroyed. And so during this period, the United States was providing a lot of economic aid, a lot of military aid. This is where the United States starts to get established as a global policeman. And also as a result of this time period, the United States began building military bases just all over the world. And pretty much every major choke point, every continent, the United States began building massive military bases, which was, of course, very expensive. We didn't do that, though, for no reason. We did that because in conjunction with our efforts to rebuild these economies that had been destroyed by the war, we also wanted to build safe trade routes so that we could trade our goods and purchase goods from other countries. After all of this infrastructure was built, the United States progressed out of its manufacturing boom into a more powerful kind of boom, which was a tech boom, which did leave some people behind, but it kept the United States as a whole as the most powerful nation, because as other countries got their manufacturing infrastructure back in place, the United States no longer had a monopoly and no longer had a competitive advantage in terms of manufacturing, but what it did have was something more powerful. It had the global influence that it had built up. It had the trade networks. It had the most powerful military. And as all of that happened, something even more important happened where the United States developed its reserve currency status, which allowed the United States to do something that countries can't typically do. It allowed the United States to incur a massive national debt and still have people willing to lend more money to us. The reason I share this history is to show a trajectory that these are the things that produced the prosperity that most Americans now enjoy today, where even Americans who are rather poorly off are typically better than most people living in most other countries. And what's fascinating about the things that generated this prosperity is when you look at this historical trajectory, it's undeniable, but it's also these very same things that in our modern political discourse, people complain about the most because they don't understand their origins and because they don't understand that these things aren't just cost centers, but these are the things that fundamentally produced our prosperity the way we now enjoy it. That goes again to the military aid we've provided to other countries, humanitarian aid, the money that we spend on our military to protect our global trade networks, and it even goes to our national debt. These are all of the things that make America powerful, but they're also the things that people are now actively trying to get rid of because they don't understand the profits, but they do understand the operating costs. And that's where we get back to the national security strategy today and why it's such a bad idea. The new national security strategy is essentially the United States pulling back from all of the capital investments that it's made over many decades because it no longer wants to incur those costs, not recognizing that the capital expenses were already made and now is the time to actually enjoy the profits. In the new national security strategy, we are pulling back from our traditional allies, not just military allies, but economic allies who objectively made us extremely prosperous, which are the European countries. And we are establishing a posture of criticizing those countries rather than continuing the system that made us so wealthy. On top of this, we are also pulling back from our global power, not recognizing that it is this global power that has given us so much prosperity by securing safe trade routes. And it is this very security of these trade routes that has allowed us to produce a reserve currency, which has allowed us to, for example, purchase goods that are produced in other countries far more cheaply, where somebody's labor in China or in Taiwan or in any other Eastern Asian country, we have the benefit because of being the reserve currency power of being able to basically purchase those people's labor for pennies on the dollar, where somebody will work for an entire day for what we would earn typically in less than an hour. And a lot of those people are very happy to earn that wage. In the United States, we don't recognize what a blessing and what a benefit it is to sit at the top of this system because we've gotten really so fat on the benefits of the system that we have stopped doing the hard work to understand how the system actually works. And the problem with that is we are knocking the foundation out from under our own feet. And we're not just doing that from a practical standpoint, we're also doing it from a rhetorical standpoint, where we're not just making these strategic withdrawals, but we're doing them with very targeted, very direct language against our former allies, where we are being very clear with our former allies that we no longer like or respect them the way that we once did. Now, in my country, it's becoming popular to cheer on these sort of harsh statements, or at least this combative language that's directed towards our former allies, as if it's a sort of sign of strength, forgetting that we learned in kindergarten that words have consequences, and often they have unintended consequences. And when it comes to combative language, one of the unintended consequences is that once you start to unwind the system, especially in this way, it's hard to build it back the way it was. Because lo and behold, when you are harsh towards people, when you undermine trust, people stop trusting you. And trust is one of the big things that this global system has been built on. And a lot of people in the United States don't realize the benefit that they get simply from inertia. Where because we were this power that supported these countries after World War II and continued that progress of support up until now, a lot of these countries, their go-to whenever they wanted to trade or do any other kind of partnership was just to go to the United States because we were friends and we trusted each other. Just like how you as an individual person might, just because you don't really feel like looking for an alternative, go to the same small business over and over again, even if the price structure isn't as aggressive or as good for you as you could get somewhere else. A lot of that happens to the United States, where we have benefited in a massive way because of inertia, because people liked us, because people trusted us. But now we're actively trying to undermine that trust to get quote unquote better deals, not recognizing that the better deals that we meant on paper actually undermine a lot of really good deals that we were already getting, but that maybe the profits just weren't as clear and as obvious. Lo and behold, when you undermine trust, people don't want to work with you. And unfortunately, if they don't want to work with you, they're going to start looking for other partners. And in the case of the United States, a lot of people are also moving because of our national security strategy and the type of political events that have preceded it and that are certain to follow it. They're now moving to partner more with our political adversaries like China, when we could have kept them in our sphere by literally doing nothing. Now, these strategic costs, as an American, at least I could say maybe it's worth it if there was a clear benefit, a clear trade-off that we were pursuing by setting these things aside. But unfortunately, that just doesn't seem to be the case. And one of my biggest criticisms of the new national security strategy that my country has unveiled is that the document is very clearly ideological and not strategic, which is the last thing that you want in a national security strategy. And I say it's very clearly ideological and not strategic because the document in and of itself is contradictory. It contradicts its own arguments in favor of ideology. So, for example, the document mentions how the United States should step back from the global world order because it does not want to be the national policeman anymore, the international policeman anymore. We want to focus on our own country. We don't want to intervene in other countries. In this case, meaning we don't want to intervene in dictatorships to bring more freedom to more people the way that maybe we've done in the past. But then the document goes on to say how Europe's current trajectory is extremely negative and how the United States should essentially intervene to change Europe's trajectory. And you can't really have it both ways. You can't say you want to stop intervening, stop being the international policeman, and then turn around and say, yeah, but we want to intervene over here. And so it's very clear that the national security strategy isn't about America first, America only. We only focus on ourselves and our own interests. It's very clear that it's about a certain ideology and certain preconceived political points. So, for example, the reason the United States says there needs to be change in Europe specifically is because it identifies mass migration as a problem in Europe. Which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's not the point of this video. The point is, why would the United States care about that? If mass migration is weakening Europe, why would the United States care about that? And that's where you realize it's very clearly ideological, because the Republican Party right now, of course, they're against migration into the United States, which again, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. That's not the point of this video. But when you look at it just from a strategic standpoint, if the United States was truly being strategic to lower migration to the United States, they should want to increase migration into Europe, because migrants who are able to successfully leave the Middle East or Africa or wherever and get into Europe are migrants that are not going to try to get into the United States. And so again, we realize that the document is self-defeating. It's not actually strategic. It undermines its own goals. The point of the document is ideology. And that's always a scary place to be when you're defining strategy, because ideology is where you go to win fights on Twitter. Strategy is where you go to win fights in the real world to create actual benefits. And the danger of this particular ideology is that in our quest to win a fight on Twitter, or I guess X now, we are undermining the very system that allowed giant platforms like Twitter or X now to exist in the first place. Because the reason, again, a lot of these big platforms that have been so prosperous and so good for so much of the world exist is because of the global system that the United States helped create after World War II. With all of this in mind, one of my biggest concerns about this national security strategy, when I go back again to the things that people have been talking about in national public discourse, whether those be the high costs of our military, whether that be the national debt, things of that sort, is that this national security strategy will almost certainly have the effect in the long term of taking these problems that are manageable now and turning them into unmanageable problems. For example, let's look at the US national debt. It's undeniable that the United States has a high level of national debt. That's one thing that concerns a lot of people, and it actually ultimately underpins a lot of the logic behind why the United States might change its national security strategy and its trade strategy, its approach to the old global order. A lot of people perceive the costs of the old US global order as the primary reason for the US national debt. And so in their minds, it makes the most sense to lower that debt to decrease those costs. And again, it makes sense on the surface, but actually, usually the best way to pay off debt when it's this type of system is not to lower expenses, but actually to increase profits. And a lot of people don't realize that in the case of the US global order, when you lower the expenses, again, you're also removing the profits that came with those expenses. But in the case of the US national debt, it's actually even worse, where us backing away from the global order can take this problem, which is currently very manageable. It is actually very manageable, and it can turn it into a crisis. Because people don't realize that the reason the US has been able to raise such a high national debt is actually because of a special benefit we have as the United States, where we have reserve currency status. Where because we are the global policeman, because we are the big dog in the global order, and because we have the largest economy, people want to trade with us, which means that people want to hold our dollars. This makes people more willing to buy US bonds, which are a source of US dollars, and these bonds are essentially how we raise our national debt. So the reason we've been able to have such a high national debt is because people are willing to lend to us where they wouldn't be willing to lend to other countries, because they believe in something that's printed on the back of every US dollar, where these dollars say they are backed by the full faith and trust of the US government. That full faith and trust of the US government depends on our position in the global order that we have helped to create. But what happens when people lose their full faith and trust in the US government, in the US dollar? What happens when people feel that they are being pushed out of trading with the United States because the United States wants to focus on internal trade and things of that sort? Well, when these people cease to want to trade with the United States as much, they won't need as many US dollars, and they'll actually prefer to hold other types of currencies instead of US dollars. That reduces the demand for US bonds. That reduces the United States' ability to actually manage their debt the way that they have been. And again, this thing that has been a kind of brewing problem that's been manageable could become a crisis if we try to just change the global order overnight that has underpinned our national security and has actually allowed us to raise this debt, not just as a liability, but as an instrument by which we have created the actual physical prosperity, because it is with this debt that we have purchased so much of the infrastructure, so much of the technology, built so many of the companies that have made America so wealthy in the first place. Long story short, the United States is currently in the process of sacrificing their long-term prosperity because they're trying to optimize for short-term benefits, not understanding the system that they sit on top of. They are looking around themselves and they're seeing only negatives, not realizing all the positives about their country that are actually true. Sure, the United States isn't a perfect country. No country is perfect. The United States has serious problems. But objectively, when you look at the United States, especially as a country of their size, the prosperity is absolutely insane. And so it's crazy that we always complain about how poor we are and how much we're getting ripped off, when objectively we're more prosperous than all the people that we complain are ripping us off. In reality, when you understand that this is all part of the global system we created and you realize how all the pieces fit together, you realize it's typically not us being ripped off. It's just us not understanding the system and how it works. In reality, when you look at the United States, most people here can live a happy life if they want to. They have a lot of freedom. And a lot of other countries want to come and be part of the United States. People want to immigrate to the United States or model their systems after the United States, or at least historically they have, because we built such a great country on such a great system. Now we are trying to unravel that system for who knows what reason, but it's not going to work. And that's my warning. Now, of course, in today's political environment, people will watch a video like this and they'll think that the objective is a political thing in the sense of Republicans versus Democrats. But the reality is that that's not the case, because all of the points in this video historically have been upheld by both Republicans and Democrats, who, despite the fact that they have always had their differences, since this global order has been established in the United States, have broadly agreed on these things. They have broadly agreed on geopolitics, and they have broadly worked together to support and build this system, because it's a system that's good for everybody within the United States, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter. Again, ideology might win fights on Twitter. Strategy is actually what creates real-life benefits. What's happening today is different. What's happening is we have people who are trying to leave a system that has been objectively successful and that has had bipartisan support from people that they would respect for many generations. And they're trying to leave it just because, well, I don't know why. I really don't know why. I don't think the American people really voted for this. I know a lot of Republicans who voted for this administration that didn't vote for this. And so whatever is going on right now, it doesn't need to be this way. There's still a chance for the United States to go back to the way it was, to be the global power it was, which was good not just for the United States, even though selfishly it was, but also for so many other people on the planet, people around the world. Now, that's part of the reason I have this channel, to break through the headlines, to break through the bias, and to just bring the facts and the strategy to bear with all of the relevant context, whether it's historical or economic or geopolitical, trying to bring these things that are complicated and that get oversimplified back to the appropriate level of complexity, but in a way that people can still understand. So if you appreciate that, you've watched this far in the video, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And also consider supporting the channel in one of a number of other ways. There's links in the description of the video. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. I appreciate all your support and making this channel happen, and I look forward to seeing you on future videos.